Okay, so now we're looking at the final section, beginning with a few videos here, on the idea of agriculture, agricultural challenges, and the things related to sustainability. So we're trying to look at the different sustainability factors in different parts of the world as they relate to agriculture. So some of this is going to be very global, some of it's going to be very local. We're going to try and combine these ideas as we can, because this also relates to economics and not just the environment as well, because typically, when we talk about when things go wrong, they also, in terms of the environment, they also hurt the economic side as well, as we will see. So here we go. So in terms of, the ideas in general, so we have the issues of feeding the world, so things of food security, we'll talk about food deserts, the accessibility to food, undernourishment that we've kind of already mentioned, issues about, what types of food should we be eating even, the ideas of, conventional farming or genetically modified foods or versus organic, and how much are those cost. The idea of, again, subsistence versus commercial farming, as we've been kind of discussing, but we haven't really talked about, at least in the videos and in class, we haven't really been discussing the idea of, which one is better for the globe, subsistence or commercial in terms of sustainability, access, things of that nature. Okay, we also have the issues of developed versus developing, or less developed versus more developed countries in the international trade, who produces what foods and why. So think in terms of, again, this is more about the idea of plantation farming. So again, look back at that at 9.3 if you haven't yet. The cost of food and food production, and then how much energy is used in that. Other uses of crops, so thinking for, other uses for crops and crop land, environmental threats, and, connecting back to the idea of Mr. Thomas Malthus. So looking at one of these issues in particular is the loss of agricultural land. So a lot of land that could be used for agricultural purposes is actually converted over to a number of different things. So this includes, for homes, towns, roads, factories, parks. Think way back to the beginning of the year when we did the Looking for Lawns article, okay, about the whole point of, turning land, that we're, here we are watering our, our lawns, but it's like, it's just grass. It looks nice. We don't actually need it. We also, in many cases, overwater it when we don't have to, again, to make it look nice. And so converting all that away from what could be farmland where we could be growing crops, raising animals to feed ourselves. And typically what we lose is what we consider to be the prime agricultural land, which is the most productive land that we could be using for agricultural purposes. And so that's something that we've lost globally over the years. Due to population growth, urbanization, things of that nature, urban sprawl fitting into that. Okay. At the same time, due to climate change and just kind of bad weather patterns, at the same time, you can see too much precipitation weakens the topsoil. That's the very top of the actual soil, hence topsoil. And so when that happens, crops are more likely to blow away or wash away when either it rains too much or gets too windy. So that's historically, think of the Dust Bowl in the 1930s that affected much of the Midwest and the Maine South when you think of like Texas, Oklahoma, Kansas area. Okay, but also again wash away with floods. This can be prevented by conservation tillage, and we'll see an example of that either in this presentation or the next one. So leaving crops in the fields. So when we talk about conservation tillage, you leave crops in the fields to reduce erosion, because that way you're not pulling from the ground. You're letting the soil recuperate, the nutrients stay in, to reduce the chance of erosion and the loss of that land. Okay. We also, one other big thing is land deterioration due to desertification. Hence, it sounds very much like a desert. And this happens again for a variety of things. Typically, they are connected to one another. So population, again, when you're doing that, you're using too much of the stuff for other purposes. You're planting too many crops too often in poor climates. So again, think of in subsistence agriculture. Again, and think like places like India and China, places in South and Southeast Asia, or even Sub-Saharan Africa, where you're double cropping, or sometimes even triple cropping, or you're not letting the land ever really regrow. You're just constantly using it. There's no shifting cultivation, or you don't shift it long enough, or you don't let it recover long enough. And so what happens is, the plants get weaker, the soil gets weaker. So there's not any full recovery. And you can think about that too in terms of overgrazing of animals, that again, you're eating it until, or you're essentially getting rid of everything until there's nothing left. And you've done long-term or permanent damage to the soil. And then there's just overall deforestation. Okay, cutting down of trees. Think of the Amazon rainforest. Every year You're losing more and more of that. You have poor irrigation systems, not being able to water stuff or watering stuff too much, or not too much in the case of desertification, but poor irrigation where you're not providing enough water to many of your crops, and then just droughts, okay, where you're not able to get enough water in there. So I think California's been in drought-like conditions for, it seems like, decades, but it hasn't been that long, but it's been well over a decade at this point, and that plays in. Okay, so in terms of here we have a chart with food production and food per capita. So food production is this line right here. So we go back to the idea of how much we were able to produce versus the number of people. So again, I don't know if this is supposed to be about the United States, but again, we can produce more, but the food per capita per person hasn't really, it's increased a little bit, not a whole lot. Okay, but then we also have the idea of agricultural land, which has not really increased. It's actually been on a slight decrease as our populations around the globe have increased. But again, as we've said, we can produce more with less. But there's a problem again when we connect it back to issues like desertification, yield rates, things of that nature. And so we consider this in terms of how does this connect itself to agricultural and physiological density and just overall density when population is continually rising, but the amount of land that we're using to grow food on is not increasing. So this is where tech is really, really important. Okay, so and then here we are looking at it in the United States. Okay, so we have the United States here on the left, Minnesota on the right. So areas where we're talking about high quality farming in the path of development. So expanding, urbanization, cities, towns of that nature. So what's high quality farmland and high development? So areas where there's really great prime agricultural land and high areas of development are in the red, and then high quality farmland and low areas. So areas where we're not seeing a whole lot of growth, southeastern Minnesota, or sorry, this would be southwestern Minnesota, but around the metro, you're still seeing a lot of that land be taken away in terms of, again, housing, cities, things of that nature. Then particularly looking a lot, again, what's left out of that is that we're losing a lot of what's left of that, good farmland. And then, the idea here in Minnesota, looking more specifically at Minnesota, okay? Again, you can kind of see this more up close that, on the fringes of the cities, the Minneapolis-St. Paul Twin Cities, we are slowly expanding and taking over more and more of that as the population expands and the suburbs get bigger and further away from the city. You're encroaching on the farmland. I remember, like I said, Wayzata, I don't know why I'm pulling at my Simile jacket when I say Wayzata. But again, when the high school was built out in Wayzata, out in the corner of Plymouth, there was not a whole lot of farmland out there. Or sorry, there was a lot of farmland out there. There was not really anything else there. Now, in the last 10 plus years, they are, the farms are pretty much gone. It's all housing developments and schools that continue to expand on that. And that's just kind of, again, that urban sprawl that we'll, come back and talk to you again later. But again, we're losing quality farmland that we won't be able to get back, or if we can, it will not be very easy because then you have to kick people off of their homes. All right. So, and then you can kind of see here, map of desertification globally. Okay, areas that are very high in terms of desertification versus very low. And then you have, your non-arid land or just arid land. So deserts would be very arid. So again, North Africa, Sahara Desert, Middle East, a lot of mountainous regions too. I'm sorry, non-arid land would not be. So out west, you can kind of see there's low areas that are degrees of hazard for desertification. Not a whole lot that's in the low category. A lot of it in the United States, as you can see here, the yellow is moderate. You got very high throughout much of the West. That includes the Dakotas, Wyoming, Montana, Washington State, Oregon, dangerous levels. And then again out here, kind of again in other parts of the globe. So not very promising when you see the low numbers is not that high. Okay. Then here's the ridge tillage, okay, on the land and things of that nature. Again, leaving the crops in to cover and protect the soil. So the second issue, and this is what we're going to end the video on, is on issue number 2, is using crops for things other than human consumption. So we talk about not only using the land for things other than farming, but also using the crops for things other than for us eating them. All right, so this is obviously from a very human-centric perspective. Okay, in many cases, we use crops for other things than what we eat. Okay, in many cases, drugs. So you can kind of see on this chart in particular, or this map, you can see heroin in the purple and cocaine. So using crops for things, instead of human consumption. You can also think about medical crops as well, not just hard drugs is what's listed here. Okay, but then you also have land that's used for non-essential foods, things that we do not need to survive. And when I say coffee, some of you are going to be like, okay, Gerber, but that's how I pay attention to you every day. Yeah, I mean, you're probably not wrong. I mean, I'd find myself boring and dull too if I had to do that. But with that being said, coffee is a nicety. It's not a necessity, even though you might think it is from time to time if you really like coffee. All right, but we spend it on non-essential foods like snacks, coffee, things that aren't necessarily healthy for us that we could convert it again back to other usage if we were so inclined to do. But there's a lot of money to be made in coffee, in chocolates, in goldfish crackers. Going back to the idea of these hard drugs, heroin and cocaine. This is where unfortunately, a lot of money gets made globally on drug trafficking. All right, but then we also use, and I've mentioned this before, using crops to feed other animals. All right, using them to essentially get cows and chickens and pigs fat and then slaughter them instead of feeding ourselves. So that's a lot of food that we have to produce just to feed other animals to then eat that animal. All right. And again, if we had king corn, we would again look at that. But this is it makes a bigger issue about, if you were to be vegetarian or something, this is a good argument for it because the process of, getting these animals to grow in size and the fact that, the increasing number of meat around the globe, or the demand for meat, is growing, especially in areas around the globe that can now afford meat. In the United States, we 30% of our diet is like, cows, chicken, and pork. Around the globe, that's not really the case, but now it's going to become that again as diversification, globalization, population growth. And so that's going to take more and more energy and more other crops that we could just be eating ourselves that we're then feeding to animals to then kill the animals. So makes a good case for being a vegetarian. I'm not, and I have no plans on it, but it's a fair argument to be making. All right, and then we also have, use of crops for biofuels. All right, so think, E85 ethanol with corn, soybeans, things of that nature that we could, again, use for human consumption, or we're turning it into stuff to fuel our cars. Okay. So yeah, we will stop there on issue 2, and we will come back on issue 3 when we talk about what are conversations about expanding the food supply and how does that connect to issues of sustainability.